what we're going to be talking about is the evolution of science fiction. Science fiction's gone from the presentation of rather fantastic ideas, and it's moved forward and evolved into speculative fiction. That's what they call it now. So the so we're going to talk about that evolution, and one particular genre in particular is cyberpunk, which is looking at the impact of technology and then kind of speculating into the near future what the impacts of that are going to be and what it's going to make society look like. So I have to say, I've heard people talk about the books that they're reading and these wonderful Pulitzer Prize winning books with serious themes. I, however, since a very young age, have been drawn to books with rocket ships on their covers. And then as I've gotten older and I've looked at this, I've been able to look at this from a broader perspective. I've come to realize that since its beginning, science fiction has commented on trends in societies. They explore the relationships, or they talk to the trends that are happening at the times that the books were created. And like I said, we're gonna talk about how we've gone from science fiction to speculative fiction, with writers thinking about what society is going to look like in the near future, not too distant future. So for the sake of the discussion, let's look at the beginnings of the genre. So, you know, just as a starting point, let's take H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. So it was written in 1895, and even though it might not occur to us, there were a lot of breakthroughs in science and technology that were happening. So first of all, the society was becoming more connected. There were improvements in steam engines. Steam engines were hauling passengers and cargo at the unimagined speed of 60 miles an hour. So earlier in the 19th century, mankind could only move as fast as animals could pull them or the wind could carry them. There was breakthroughs in communication with the advent of the telephone or telegraph lines. So things that were happening hundreds and thousands of miles away could be transmitted to a different location in a matter of minutes. And so these two trends brought about huge changes in society. So in the early 19th century, life was really local. Most people lived in intergenerational households. They spent their lives within about a 25 or 30-mile radius of where they were born. Yes, there were people that were pioneers and part of the westward expansion, but that was a relatively small segment of society. So now people were leaving their birthplaces, going to distant cities for new opportunities. And society, in particular in the United States, felt more cohesive and connected. So it went from the United States plural, the United States are, to the United States singular. The United States is. So the growing feeling of an interconnected nation state and a cohesive society. You know, so then you look at other things that were going on, like the discovery of X-rays, right? There was all kinds of things that were happening. There was experimentation with unpowered and powered flight, and discovery of new chemical elements like argon. And so there was a philosophical sense that human intellect had reached this pinnacle, that we were using science and in a way that allowed us to unlock God's secrets and harness them for the greater good of humankind. So in the midst of all of that, here comes H.G. Wells, and he's looking at what's going on and all these incredible breakthroughs. And so, well, why not, with all this developing industrial capacity, surely it's only a matter of time before somebody invents a device that allows us to travel through time. Now, granted, Einstein showed up about 30 years or so later and said, well, gee, maybe that's going to be harder than we thought. So cyberpunk, like other genres of science fiction, it was a reaction to things that were happening at a particular time in society. So it was launched in the mid-1980s. Computers were becoming smaller. They were more available for more purposes. This technology was beginning to spread. So people began to think about, okay, well, what's that? What impact is this going to have on society? The other influences, the punk part of cyberpunk, it developed from the punk rock scene that was happening in New York in the mid to late 1970s. Punk rockers had a particularly nihilistic attitude. There was a lot of disillusionment with the system because of the aftermath that what was happening in the late 1960s and the 1970s. And then there was the rise of the hacker culture. Now, at that time, hackers did not have the negative connotation that they have today, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But they were seen as outsiders, as rebels. They were helping push the technology along. So, like I said, there was, science fiction, speculative fictions. It's a reaction to what's happening in society. It had forebearers, the authors of the 1950s and the 1960s, looking at what was going on and what was happening in society and then talking about it. So authors like Ray Bradbury, who wrote the book I, Robot, which dealt with, it was an early discussion, thought exercise in what artificial intelligence might look like, and more importantly, what would happen if this construct that we created got out of control. Then there's Isaac Asimov and the Foundation trilogy. And please pardon the typo there, I just noticed. And, so the Foundation trilogy imagines humanity existing concurrently in multiple galaxies, and how are we going to govern that? How are we going to keep humanity connected and have a cohesive society across different galaxies that are light years apart? And then there's a really interesting English author, John Brunner, who was active in the early 1970s. Two of his books that really, over time, has struck me as being particularly prescient were The Web of Everywhere and The Sheep Look Up. The Web of Everywhere was written in, I think, 1975. So it was literally within 2 or 3 years of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, developing the protocols and the technology that became the forerunner of the internet. And so, almost immediately, here comes John Brunner thinking about, well, geez, there's going to be access to all this information. It'll be available instantaneously. And how might that be used? And more importantly, how might it be misused and have a negative impact on society, the unintended consequences. Then there was another novel that he wrote called The Sheep Look Up. And we're kind of living the reality of The Sheep Look Up. It imagines society about 40 or 50 years later after the novel was written, where earlier generations ignored the signs and symptoms of climate change and what that might do with us and how that's going to impact us, and how can we possibly work through this when we're in the midst of a continual crisis. So that might sound familiar to a few of you who are listening. And then there's another author that I found really fascinating, Philip K. Dick. So he wasn't commercially successful during his lifetime. He lived in California. He lived in a rented 2-bedroom apartment in Anaheim, California, but he produced some really amazing novels that later went on to become major motion pictures and very widely known. So the first one of his novels, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? This became the basis for the movie The Blade Runner. So again, it's dealing with, like, okay, we're on our way, or at some point in the future, we're going to create this thing called artificial intelligence. What if it gets out of control? How can we rein it back in? There was the Minority Report, which was another explanation of AI and how it could be used to solve problems and do situational analysis in near real time. And so his construct of AI was, it had biological components. There were specially bred chimpanzee, and their brains were kind of the central processing units. And, like the three of them were supposed to come together, but the dissenting opinion was called the Minority Report. And so there's one particular incident where, like it turns out the Minority Report was right and the adventures ensue. And then there's a third one that's now a series on Amazon Prime, The Man in the High Castle. And it posed the question, well, what if the Germans had won World War II? What would society look like? What would be going on? How would people respond to this? How would people react to it and oppose to it? So, like I said, not successful during his lifetime, but a highly, highly well-regarded author and influential author in retrospect. Okay, so now we're coming to the time, we're in the 1980s, and the cyberpunk genre is beginning to emerge. And so, what was going on? What did that look like? So the first thing that happened was computers were becoming more affordable, more available. They could be, because they were smaller and more affordable, they could be applied more widely to solve problems or provide services. On the left is a picture of a DEC PDP-11, which is one of the first computers that I programmed on. And, we thought we were really something, writing basic programs on the DEC PDP-11. The truth of the matter is that the computer in your car and the smartphone that you carry around in your pocket has more processing power than a DEC PDP-11 or the other contemporary machines of the era. But the important thing is computers are getting smaller. IBM mainframes, you needed to have a room the size of a warehouse to set up your mainframe. Even in the 1970s and 1980s, mainframes took millions of dollars to set up and operate. And so now we have these smaller machines. You can have more of them, and the costs are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Big step forward. The other thing is there were new ways to become interconnected. So the TCP/IP protocols, telecommunications, internet working protocols that came out of the DARPANET project that was the forerunner of the internet were coming into widespread use. So all of a sudden, corporations and government agencies and universities, there were, there was this ability to interconnect in a way that wasn't possible, that led to a whole other level of information sharing and interoperability. And then there was, and then as I mentioned earlier, there's the rise of the hacker culture. So hackers in the 1980s, they were seen as rebels. They were trying to overcome a limitation that was created by limited access to time on computers. So it was like getting access to write programs or do things on a computer. It was a rationed resource. So when I was first getting involved with this, I was working at UCLA Medical Center, and I was using early automated systems that were just beginning to emerge in healthcare. And I was extracting data from them to write programs to do analysis for quality assurance purposes. And I had to go to different departments on the UCLA campus and beg for time on a system. So hackers were gaining access to systems. They were breaking into them, not to take the systems over, but just so they could improve their skills as programmers or experiment in ways that they couldn't in the time-limited, the time-limited setup that was available during the era. One of these hackers was a young guy named Bill Gates. He broke into a computer system in an engineering firm in Bellevue and was using it to improve his skills as a programmer. He got caught, and the engineering firm ended up hiring him, and we know the rest of his story. So the first author that is identified as a cyberpunk writer was William Gibson. William Gibson's a Canadian American. His first novel is called Neuromancer. Neuromancer takes place on a remote planet that's settled and governed by a corporation with a very rigid social hierarchy. They use technology to control people. There's definitely a 1% and a 99%. And the main character is a biologically modified individual who becomes a street fighter. And so there's a couple of significant trends here. So you think about street fighting, and in our time, the rise of mixed martial arts to as opposed to traditional boxing. So there were definitely foreshadowings of that. And there was another thing. The main character used security cameras to capture his fights, and then he would hack into the systems and distribute the video of his fights as entertainment. So the pervasive use of observational technology, cameras in public spaces, capturing images from those cameras to create content and distribute it in a way that's analogous to what Instagram influencers and YouTube stars are doing. I mean, like, it was really very forward thinking, very imaginative, taking a look at what was happening in the current time and saying, well, if we do X, then surely we'll be able to do Y in the not too distant future. And it might have Z result on society, both good and bad. His later and more recent novels are set in the present time or the relatively near future. And so one of the topics that he's delving into is the use and misuse and the pervasiveness of digital advertising and digital marketing. Two of his novels in that score are called Pattern Recognition and All Tomorrow's Parties. There's another novel that he wrote that actually has echoes all the way back to the time machine. It's called The Peripheral. And in this future society, there's people that are using technology and they're able to project themselves, broadcast themselves backwards in times and take over or kind of coexist in people's minds. And what they're doing is they're trying to nudge history in a more favorable direction to correct issues and problems that they're experiencing in their own time. And then, so, there's the creation of sort of like parallel tracks of history, alternate realities. And so it's a pretty entertaining read. And again, a lot of imagination, a lot of thought given to what we're doing with technology and what we might do in the future. So there's another author that I really like, Neal Stephenson. He's originally from Baltimore. He now lives in Washington State. His first novel, Snow Crash, came out in 1992. And it was really, there's a lot of things that were really prescient that he talked about in this novel. Now, so Snow Crash is programmer slang back in the good old days when programs only executed on a single computer. A snow crash is when you had a bug in your program that was so severe, all that you were left with was static on the screen when the program tried to execute the bug. So in Snow Crash, Neal Stevens imagines a society that's dominated by online social platforms. In his future society, he talks about a platform called the metaverse. He imagines social media as this pervasive virtual reality experience that people immerse themselves in, and the social isolation that comes along with that. He also imagines a society where people are working primarily at service-oriented jobs for minimum wages. The protagonist, the protagonist in the novel is a Japanese man. It's really a great tongue-in-cheek name for the character. He calls him hero protagonist. Hero spelled the Japanese spelling Hiro. And so there's just all kinds of things that he imagines about society that are really entertaining. So, for example, formerly criminal enterprises that have now gone mainstream and become corporate entities. So, the mafia opening up a chain of pizza stores, Cosa Nostra Pizza, and in fact, hero protagonist is a delivery driver for Cosa Nostra Pizza as his day job. The street gangs like the Crips have become lifestyle brands, and they're marketing and selling things like Lil Crips baby onesies. So it's imaginative stuff. It's eerily accurate as to the impact that this type of platform could have on society. And naturally, there's bad guys in all of these societies, and in this particular case, there's a dark faction in the metaverse that's introducing malware that takes over people's mind and exerts mind control over them. So, no, we haven't gone quite that far, but if you think of the echo chamber effect of platforms like Facebook, he really isn't that far off. And he's continued to write books that show a lot of imagination, a lot of anticipations of trends. There's one book, Reality, which is it's a corruption of the README file that's typically found in a lot of programs, but in this case, instead of getting instructions or parameters, if you open up this particular README file, it takes over your bank account and does things that we now associate with malware. Again, he was ahead of the curve on this in discussing the notion of cyber theft. His latest novel is a novel called The Fall. The main character is the owner of a game company, and he lives in Seattle. He's living the tech billionaire life. He has a penthouse apartment in Belltown that overlooks the Elliott Bay, and then he suddenly dies during a minor routine medical procedure, and in his will he specifies that he wants an image of his mind uploaded onto a computer and live this digital afterlife. And so it talks about the challenges of making something like that happen, but eventually it does. And then there's all of the implications and things that go on during the creation of this virtual society. So it's a really thought-provoking and fun read. So sort of the heirs of the cyberpunk genre, like moving on, we now get into what the genre is commonly referred to. It's speculative fiction. There's a lot of what ifs involved, a lot of thought-provoking scenarios. One novel that I've just completed is written by a woman named Maria Doria Russell. It's called The Sparrow, and it centers around the fact that at the Arecibo radio telescope in Puerto Rico, they've discovered evidence of an alien civilization. They're receiving regular broadcasts where this alien species is singing and performing music. The astronomer that discovered this is friends with the Jesuit priest. They put together an expedition to go to this ancient civilization, and it brings up really, because there's a Jesuit involved, they get into some really interesting territory, like, well, if God created the universe and mankind are children of God, is this completely alien species that looks nothing like us or acts nothing like us? Are they also children of God? And then because it's written by a woman, there's this really delightfully nuanced presentation of the relationships between the men and the woman that are part of the expedition. So again, it's just a really entertaining book to read. There's a novel that I really enjoyed by another Northwesterner, Greg Bear. The novel is The Years of Rice and Salt, and his alternative future, he imagines that Europe was decimated in a far worse way by the bubonic plague than actually happened in history. And so China and the Persian empires remain the dominant cultural force. And so, as a result, what would society look like in that case? And so there's scenarios like the Chinese making trans-Pacific voyages to set up trading relationships with native people on the west coast of North America and the Incas in Peru. So it's just a really, really interesting book and an interesting way to stretch your imagination. And then there's a series of novels called The Expanse. They're written by James S.A. Corey. James S.A. Corey is actually two people, Daniel Abraham and Ty Frank. And, like the plot, up to this point, it stretches across a series of 7 novels. The starting point is that an unethical corporation discovers a remnant of ancient alien technology from an alien society that's extinct. They set about trying to weaponize it, and then there's 3 groups that are all jockeying for position and trying to come up with their own uses of this alien technology. So there's the society on Earth, which represents the old world, which is governed by a single entity, the United Nations. It's overpopulated. There's people who are living only on minimum subsistence payments made by this government. There's Mars, which is a representation of a breakaway republic, and it's meant to represent the United States. They refer to themselves as the Constitutional Republic of Mars. And then there's a society that exists entirely in outer space. The people are born and live their lives in outer space. They're referred to as the Belters, and they, are mining asteroids and things like that. And so you have this really complex interplay of these 3 future societies that are trying to, you know, in some cases they're forming alliance against, you know, one of the other groups, and they're all trying to gain an advantage and take over and control the use of this alien technology. So it's also, this is also a series on Amazon Prime. Yeah, it is called The Expanse, and I don't know about you, but I started watching it, and I got hooked on the books, and I got hooked on the TV series as well. So anyway, thank you for listening to me ramble on. I appreciate everybody showing up.